Welcome, everyone. We have a number of folks making their way in from the waiting room, so we will get started in just a moment. Welcome, welcome. Thank you to everyone joining us live for today's Lunch and Learn, a roadmap to responsible offshore wind development in the Gulf of Maine. And a hello to all the viewers watching on YouTube. Offshore wind represents an exciting opportunity for Maine's clean energy future, our economy, and our communities. As a culmination of 18 months of collaborative, stakeholder-driven work, the Maine Governor's Energy Office recently released a draft of the Maine Offshore Wind Roadmap, which is a plan to develop offshore wind industry that works for Maine's people, economy, and heritage. Celina Cunningham is the Deputy Director of the Governor's Energy Office. She is with us today along with Stephanie Watson, who manages the office's offshore wind program. And they're going to walk us through the roadmap and explain how Maine looks to become a model for the nation for floating offshore wind development done right. Welcome to both of you. My name is Kathleen Neal. I am the Senior Director of Policy and Partnerships here at Maine Conservation Voters and Maine Conservation Alliance. Our organizations represent more than 13,000 members and supporters dedicated to protecting Maine's environment and our democracy. MCA does that through education, collaboration, and advocacy, and MCV by influencing public policy, holding politicians accountable, and winning elections. A few technical notes for today. We will hear from our speakers first and then tackle your questions in the Q&A session at the end. You don't have to wait, though. You can send your questions to me through the chat whenever they occur to you. I'll keep track of them and ask those questions following the presentation. We ask that you not message our speakers directly, as we want their focus on the presentation, not the chat box. If you have any technical difficulties today, you can reach out to Will Sedlak through the message box, and he will help you out. This event is being recorded, and the video will be posted on our website later this afternoon, where you can also find recordings of all of our previous Lunch and Learns. Thank you again for joining us. And Celina, I will turn things over to you to kick it off.
Thanks, Kathleen. And thank you to MCV for having the Governor's Energy Office here with you today. And thank you for everyone for joining this discussion. So I'll spend some time talking through what offshore wind is for those who want to hear a little bit more about that, talk about the offshore wind initiative in the state of Maine, as well as the roadmap process that we've undertaken. And as Kathleen noted, has been released in draft form and is near final. So we'll give you a preview of what's to come in the final document, and also give you a few updates on other activities that are relevant in the offshore wind space for the Governor's Energy Office. So Stephanie, if you can share the slides, I can start going through. Great, you can go to the next one. So offshore wind in the Gulf of Maine has a number of unique advantages. It's a really strong renewable energy resource, and it is Maine has some of the highest sustained winds, and those resources are strong in the evening and strong in the winter when Maine needs it most. So it's also close to generation load and provides economic development opportunities for the state and the region. Next slide. So in terms of how offshore wind works, this is not a specific project, but just to give you a sense of a depiction from the federal government. You can see there are turbines offshore, and then cables that may or may not be buried depending on the water depth, and mooring lines connecting the foundation of the turbines to the seabed. There is then often an offshore wind substation and a cable that goes to shore that is buried where possible. It then connects to an onshore substation and then provides energy to the regional electricity system. Next slide. Offshore wind technology has really advanced over the last decades, and the size of the turbines continues to grow. At some point, we anticipate that will plateau, but I wanted to just show you this picture that as you're hearing about how we are going to build these projects, how we're going to build the industry, it's important to know how large they are in terms of the physical space and the height. So just provide this picture for you there. Next slide. And what we've seen south of here in terms of planned offshore wind and projects underway are fixed bottom platforms. Those are the two turbines on the left of the screen. In the Gulf of Maine, given the water depth, we're going to need floating technology, and those are the three options on the right. You'll utilize different technology depending on the water depth that there these projects in, as well as other they have different characteristics. And so you can see the three there. Next slide. As many of you know, we are lucky to have homegrown technology development here in Maine, and the University of Maine has patented Volturnus semi-submersible technology for a foundation. This is built out of concrete, meaning that we can have it can be manufactured here in Maine as opposed to steel, which would be likely imported. So it just shows that we're trying to support the university as well as providing local jobs for people in Maine. Next slide. Taking a step back, the offshore wind industry has grown tremendously worldwide. We've seen a lot of development in Europe as well as Asia, and you can just get a sense of the sheer size. We're looking at over 50 gigawatts or 50,000 megawatts of offshore wind capacity installed. That's over 250 projects. So, well, there are certainly new things that we need to learn about floating technology. Offshore wind is not new, and it's continuing to grow rapidly around the world. Next slide. In the US, the Biden administration has set a goal of 20 or 30 gigawatts by 2030. In setting that goal, the administration also set a path for commercial leasing. And in the Gulf of Maine, we're looking at lease sale in 2024. So that is a federal process that the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management goes through for identifying areas that are suitable for commercial leasing for offshore wind. And so that is an ongoing process that the state participates in, and there are opportunities for public input through that as well. And so just to give you a sense, I believe in the last couple of months, BOEM held the first fully floating offshore wind lease sale in California. The Gulf of Maine will be coming in 24. And portions of the Central Atlantic are actually floating as well. So it's a mixture of fixed and floating in terms of the strategy that the administration is building. Next slide. So in Maine, we have set ambitious clean energy and climate targets, and this includes reaching 80% renewable energy by 2030 and a goal of 100% by 2050. And we're doing this in a variety of ways. We've gone through a comprehensive climate action plan process, and we are working to implement those strategies. We're also we've also conducted a number of studies to look at how we are going to meet our renewable energy requirements. And what we've learned through that work is that a diverse portfolio is best suited for Maine in terms of what kind of energy we're going to need. We're looking at onshore resources like solar, wind, and including storage, as well as offshore wind. Next slide. And so we, in the state of Maine, are part of a regional grid with other states, many of which have set ambitious climate and energy targets. And so right now, this is what this shows is where the energy comes from in terms of the regional grid. and 10% is renewable energy. So as a region as a whole, we have a lot of work to do, as we have made a lot of progress, but there's more work to do in terms of meeting the energy needs of both our state as well as the region. Next slide. So how we're doing that is working through a number of different steps in terms of meeting our energy goals. And the Maine Offshore Wind Initiative was launched in 2019 by the governor. The governor's energy office is leading this effort and working collaboratively with agencies across the state government and focusing on a number of different priorities. And if you go to the next slide, I can walk you through how we're doing that. And so we're focused on planning and stakeholder engagement. Today, we'll focus on the roadmap. As many of you know, there is also a separate process for the port, looking at how to advance a offshore wind port that the Department of Transportation is leading. And then, as I mentioned, the federal government is undergoing a process through the Gulf of Maine Task Force to identify areas for commercial leasing. We've also passed a number of bills over the last several years, and this includes establishing a research consortium that we'll talk about later today, as well as prioritizing offshore wind in federal waters. So in the state waters are 3 miles from the coast, 3 miles and beyond are federal waters. And we are focusing our effort on federal waters for commercial development. We also are supportive of research and development and recognizing that we are part of a broad regional, national, and local people interested in advancing offshore wind responsibly. And so we are focused on partnerships and working and learning from one another. Next slide. And when we do our offshore wind work, I just want to take a moment at the beginning to talk about the importance of the commercial fishing industry to the state of Maine. The industry provides over $3 billion of direct and indirect economic benefits to the state. And when we think about how we are going to advance renewable energy and offshore wind, specifically in a responsible manner, we think about what our actions and planning efforts and how they'll impact the fishing industry, and want to continue to have dialogue so we can protect the thousands of fishermen in the U.S. in Maine, as well as the economic opportunity and the cultural aspect of fishing to our state. Next slide. So that gets us to the Offshore Wind Roadmap, which you all came to join us and talk about today. So we received funding from the Economic Development Administration, the U.S. Economic Development Administration, to undertake a comprehensive planning effort. We formed an advisory committee with experts both in government and outside of government, covering a variety of sectors to help build a strategic plan for advancing offshore wind. We also had 4 working groups that you can see here that I just can't over-explain how important it is that we had people both in the private sector willing to dedicate their time to coming up with really, I think, thoughtful approaches to advancing offshore wind, which can be a challenging conversation at times. And so the result of what we're going to talk today is the work of the working groups as well as the advisory committee that you see here. Next slide. And so in total, there were nearly 100 members of working groups and advisory committee members who built this project. We have had over 78 public meetings. All of those, we looked to receive input from the public. We shared numerous draft documents for public review and tried to have as many conversations as we could to hear input, hear ideas, and have those ideas be reflected in the documents that we produced. We also utilized funding to conduct technical studies that were overseen by the working groups. There's a list here. Those are available on our website as well. Next slide. We are very close to a 18-month process, and we will soon have the roadmap out. Anticipate having it out later this month, and we'll be sure to share that with you when it's available. It is also the implementation process will take time, and so we look forward to continuing the dialogue around short-term, medium-term, and long-term actions that we'll be taking as a state to continue to do the work of the roadmap. Next slide. And to give you a sense of what the key themes are of the roadmap, it's really focusing on how we need to advance renewable energy to meet our climate goals. What are the economic opportunities, both in terms of specifically on the supply chain, infrastructure, workforce? How do we do this in a way that supports and sustains Maine's fisheries and coastal communities? How do we protect the environment and wildlife? And how do we support innovation and research here in the state? Through all the work what we've done, while at times the conversations were siloed, we realized that there were 4 key themes in terms of cross-cutting topics that we continually saw. And that includes the importance of regional coordination and collaboration, continuing ongoing engagement in communications with stakeholders. We have done a tremendous amount of work now, but we realize that there are important conversations to continue having with the public as well. Equity, we want to make sure that as we advance this, the industry is advanced, we do so in an equitable manner. And that includes both in terms of the process that we go through and the benefits that we see from the development. And then ensuring that we have a transparent and data-driven decision-making process. So those are the elements that you'll see throughout the document. And with that, I'll turn it over. I want to actually introduce Stephanie Watson, who is the Offshore Wind Program Manager in the state of Maine. And she is really the architect behind the Offshore Wind Roadmap and has put a tremendous amount of effort into this. And so I want her to come on and share a little bit about the details of the roadmap. But thank you very much. And with that, I'll pass it along to Stephanie.
Great, thanks, Celina. I managed to get my video back on. It's nice to be speaking with everyone today. This has been a really exciting project to be part of. And I think many of you on this call have been part of this effort. So thank you for that. We were hoping to dive into the roadmap a little bit in this call. We have 5 objectives that we came up with for the roadmap, and these basically encapsulate the work from those 4 working groups with some of the cross-cutting themes as well. These are the 5 objectives we have here. The top one on the circle, not indicating that's more important than the others, but the top one on the circle is the economic development aspects of offshore wind. So things like the supply chain, ports and workforce. We're looking to pursue these opportunities and investments to grow Maine's economy and make that economy even more resilient. Another objective is to support Maine's vital and thriving seafood industries and coastal communities, so we know are essential fabric here to our state. Another objective is to protect the environment, wildlife, and fisheries ecosystem of the Gulf of Maine, upon which most of us depend very heavily. Another objective is to advance Maine-based innovation to compete in the emerging national and global offshore wind industry. So we have a pretty good head start in a lot of ways in this space, but we'd like to keep our position there. And then another objective is to harness the abundant renewable energy to reduce long-term costs, reliance on fossil fuels, and fight climate change. So these are reflecting the themes that Celina just spoke about. Each of these objectives in the roadmap has some text underneath it describing the core idea. It also has, each objective also is supported by a set of strategies. And these strategies are essentially the elevated recommendations from the working group. And the strategies are supported in turn by some implementation actions. Celina had noted too that there, in addition to those common themes, are some cross-cutting themes like regional collaboration, equity, stakeholder engagement, and data-driven decisions and transparency. Those will be included in the roadmap throughout the discussion of each of these objectives, but in their own sections as well. And here we're going to focus in a little bit on each of the objectives. So this is objective A, the pursue offshore wind supply chain infrastructure and workforce investments. So again, these are basically elevated strategies on the right-hand side, elevating the working group recommendations. We are going to be including the full working group recommendations as appendices in the roadmap as well. So each of these strategies, as I mentioned, has a set of supporting implementation actions. And I'll just pick out a couple of these today and talk about some of the activities we're currently undertaking to bring this work to life. On the second to last bullet, ensuring opportunity and inclusivity in Maine's offshore wind workforce. Maine GEO and partners in the Clean Energy Partnership Program have recently awarded 2 offshore wind workforce development grants, one to the University of Maine for some curriculum development to train students there, and then one to a consortium, including Ironworkers 7, to do some offshore wind training. On the last bullet on industry readiness, Maine GEO and Maine International Trade Center just yesterday hosted a floating offshore wind training in Portland with 40 different businesses attending, and we'll host another on February 27th in Orono. I can follow up with the details if anyone's interested to sign up for that. But again, we're taking some of these strategies that the working groups developed and the actions under those, and we are bringing them to life now. This is just a quick look at Maine's supply chain for offshore wind. Some of this is resulting from the analysis that we did with some consultants called Exodus Group. So they took a look at some of the capabilities of companies already existing in the state of Maine and how those might be well suited for participating in the offshore wind industry and benefiting from that. The Maine International Trade Center also did some polling and found that there are at least 80 businesses across Maine that are either engaged in offshore wind already or are very interested in doing that. So I just wanted to share some of that information with you today. Here's some tangible resources for Maine businesses that are interested in offshore wind. Again, the Maine International Trade Center also has some great international and domestic trade programs to help Maine businesses get involved. And the QR code there on the bottom of the slide is you could just scan that to reach our Maine Offshore Wind Supply Chain Connect registry. That's a database that provides national visibility to Maine companies and also allows us as the state to reach out to companies who may want to learn more. Diving in a little bit onto the floating offshore wind ports. I think several of you on this call may be on that offshore wind ports advisory committee that the Maine DOT has coordinated and know a lot more about this. But this is basically a slide demonstrating the 5 different stages of fabricating an offshore wind floating foundation and installing that. So floating offshore wind is a little bit different than fixed offshore wind, and the port requirements are different. You have to have plenty of space. We also have to have heavy load capacity on shore, because you can see if you're fabricating and loading these components right at the port, you need to have a lot of both space, but also the ability of the ground to withstand all of that weight. You also need to have deep waters next to the port so that you can actually put all of these pieces together and get ready to float it out. There are no bridges or obstructions nearby because if you had that, you wouldn't be able to tow your fully assembled wind turbine generation off to site. So in floating, you do a lot of the fabrication and load out on shore, and then you float it off to the site where it would be anchored to the seafloor. So on the second objective, to harness abundant renewable energy to reduce long-term costs, I can just highlight at least one of these as strategy 2, or the strategy to consider approaches the plan for offshore wind transmission that allow for innovative, competitive, and regional action to satisfy transmission needs while meeting state policy goals. So just looking under that strategy, the state's already started this effort by joining a regional RFI for transmission with the other New England states. and looking to implement that. The next strategy focused on innovation. One of the supporting actions here is to continue to pursue the floating offshore wind research array and disseminate knowledge gained from that, so that we can all learn and improve. BOEM has, as part of the implementation of this and the related work, BOEM has determined that there's no competitive interest in our research array, so that our release application will proceed and we will have the ability to learn more about that process as we move it along. Objective D on supporting Maine's vital and thriving seafood industries and coastal communities. Under a very important part of these strategies is to have meaningful engagement with the fishing industry, with fishing businesses, fishermen, and other coastal community members. And so one of the actions is to encourage and assist the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management in providing active and direct engagement with Maine's fishing industry and the development of wind energy areas through a variety of different mechanisms. We are actively working on this. DMR is leading the state's efforts to help ensure that there is meaningful engagement by BOEM with the fishing industry to inform the commercial offshore wind leasing process in the Gulf of Maine. And then Objective E, to protect the environment, wildlife, and fisheries ecosystem in the Gulf of Maine. Here, just as an example from the strategy to enhance regional collaboration in the Gulf of Maine. Maine is a member of the Regional Wildlife Science Consortium for Offshore Wind with other Gulf of Maine states and actually other states along the Atlantic coast. And we are also, through the Maine Offshore Wind Research Consortium, reaching out to other states to serve as collaborators to that consortium so that we can learn from one another and we can align our respective resources towards better understanding offshore wind and floating offshore wind in particular. We are also including an action under this objective to promote early identification of potential submerged paleocultural sites in the Gulf of Maine. And this is based on conversations with tribal members and employees. And one of the things that we heard from our advisory committee members is that they would love to see how this roadmap will really be implemented. And I've given you a few examples of how we're already doing that, but we are taking that advisory committee recommendation to heart, and we are developing an implementation chart that will include all of the pieces here listed on this slide. So identifying a lead agency for a given action, providing any other additional information, like are there different steps involved in this that we need to take first or later. We are also including the metrics so that we can track our implementation progress and an estimated timeline for each action. So right now that document is in draft. It will be a companion document to the roadmap. We will also post this companion document on the website. In current draft, it's 42 pages, so it's pretty substantial, but we are taking it seriously that we want to go into the next step of implementing the very well developed actions from our working groups. In terms of next steps, we're targeting completion of this roadmap in February. I think we're all really excited about that. There's some great work in here and we're ready to put this out even further into the world. Our ongoing implementation of the roadmap includes pieces I mentioned today, like standing up the Maine Offshore Wind Research Consortium, continuing to engage in the BOEM process informed by this roadmap effort, developing additional stakeholder engagement opportunities, and then pursuing numerous other priorities over the short term. So there are many things that we're engaged in right now that have been informed by the roadmap process. Really appreciative and excited about that. And then finally, we'll be ensuring continued coordination and communication around the work with many different parties. Just a quick bit on the Maine Research Consortium. I've mentioned it a couple of times today, but as part of Maine's commitment to responsible offshore wind, Governor Mills and the legislature established the Maine Offshore Wind Research Consortium through legislation LD 1619 with a goal to better understand the local and regional impacts of floating offshore wind in the Gulf of Maine. These are the three, I guess, primary themes for the consortium, looking at opportunities and challenges of floating offshore wind, researching methods to avoid and minimize impacts, and also find ways to reduce costs of floating offshore wind. The consortium will have an expert advisory board with members representing Maine's fishing industry, wildlife scientists, other scientists, the offshore wind industry, and state agencies. They will meet for the first time, officially launching the consortium on February 14th. So we're really excited about that. And if you'd like to learn more, I'm happy to talk about that another time too. And I think this is over to you, Celina.
Great, thanks, Stephanie. So that is an overview of the roadmap and process. We are also, I just wanted to provide an update on a few other offshore wind related activities in the Governor's Energy Office. A couple of years ago, actually in 2020, the state announced that it was going to pursue a floating offshore wind research array in federal waters. And that would be a project that is up to 10 to 12 turbines in federal waters. And we've gone through a year process working with stakeholders to identify a site and identify the types of research questions that we may want to ask at the research array. And the reason why we're doing that is, while we think that offshore wind is very important to the long-term energy needs of the state, we also want to make sure that we can do so and build the offshore wind industry in a way that's compatible with existing ocean users, looking at how to minimize impacts and support coexistence with the fishing industry. And so we believe that the research array will be an important part in providing these valuable lessons for the state and beyond. And so earlier in January, the federal government took an important step in terms of the process for their review. We've requested a federal release. So we anticipate over the course of the year, there'll be opportunities for additional engagement as the federal government makes a decision on that lease. And then we will go through a process of planning and developing an offshore wind research array in federal waters. And I'm not sure if I mentioned it or not, it's about 40 miles off of Portland. In addition to that, we're participating in the Gulf of Maine Task Force, and there are meetings held in January, both in person and virtually. And there'll be more opportunities for public engagement coming in this spring. Because we just don't have enough to do, we also put together a proposal for funding related to community understanding the potential impacts to communities associated with offshore wind, and how to make sure that we have the right information as we pursue offshore wind. And so we put together a concept paper with a number of partners from across the state and beyond to take a look at that. We're waiting for the federal government to determine whether or not we'll pursue a full application, but that's one of several ways that we are working to utilize the infrastructure law as well as the Inflation Reduction Act to support cost-effective advancement of offshore wind. We also talked, I think Stephanie mentioned, the Clean Energy Partnership program that we have launched, including supporting offshore wind grants there. And then as we've noted, there's a separate process with the Department of Transportation related to the offshore wind port, and there will be additional meetings in March that are led by DOT, and there's more information on their website as related to the work that they're undertaking there. So with that, Stephanie and I are both available, happy to talk in detail about any of these items and hear the thoughts and questions that you have about offshore wind and the roadmap.
Oh my goodness, thank you both so much for this presentation and for all of the work that you have been leading. It has been it has been and continues to be quite a task. So thank you for your leadership. I want to let everybody know that a great way to stay up to speed with all of this work is to sign up for the Maine Offshore Wind Initiative newsletter. You will get a follow-up email later this afternoon. And if you're watching this in the recording on YouTube, you can look in the little description underneath the video and find a link to sign up for that newsletter. I also want to make sure that you all know that we are going to continue in the offshore wind vein with another Lunch and Learn next week. We'll have a number of advocates with us talking about legislation that is being considered this session at the State House to jumpstart the Maine offshore wind industry. And you'll get more information about that at the end of this program and again in that follow-up email. But we have so many terrific questions that I want to get right into them. And before we get into the weeds, Celina, Stephanie, why is offshore wind exciting to you as Mainers?
I want to hear Stephanie's answer first.
Okay, sure. Yes, from a personal perspective, I grew up on Mount Desert Island in Maine, and a lot of my classmates left Maine upon graduation, just didn't see a lot of opportunities at the time, or just felt like maybe they wanted just more breadth of opportunities. And I've felt that Maine always has a lot to offer. And this is one industry where I think Maine has so much to benefit from in terms of the economic development opportunities and the career opportunities for people, but also to, take control of our climate future and reduce the impacts of climate change that, we're all feeling throughout the state. So that's what motivates me. I think it's a really great opportunity for our state.
I agree with what Stephanie said, and we'll just add that I think it matches Maine's ingenuity and ability to solve complex problems using, we have skills that we've had for many, many decades, and putting those to use in new innovative ways is inspiring for Maine people.
It really is. And I wonder if you can say a little bit more about the role that Maine's deep water plays in choosing to lead with floating offshore wind as opposed to the fixed bottom turbines that are seen elsewhere on the East Coast.
Given our water depths in Maine, from a technology standpoint, we really do need to look at alternatives other than fixed bottom platforms, and so that allows that will be an important part of advancing offshore wind in Maine. And as many of you know, Dr. Habib Dagher from the University of Maine has really pioneered a technology here in Maine over the last decade plus, and so I think it not only is important from an innovation standpoint, but also from a technology standpoint that will need floating wind.
It is just absolutely amazing what's going on at the University of Maine. And I want to know a little bit more about the competitive advantage that we have with that floating hull design. And really, like, how was that design chosen for the research array, and how is Maine's technology fitting in with the global movement towards offshore wind?
I guess I could speak to some of the competitive advantage pieces, and then maybe I'll turn to Celina about the research array in particular. But in terms of competitive advantage for the Voltern US technology, it's made primarily. Well, I'll go back. So I think it's fascinating that the University of Maine thought to adapt their backpack and a bridge design, which is using concrete and I don't know actually how to describe it, but they're able to just use concrete and tubes to construct a bridge in like hours. And so they adapted that technology to think about, okay, we could use that kind of technology and develop a concrete semi-submersible floating structure. And the concrete advantage is that we can construct those locally in the state of Maine. We have a very strong construction industry, a lot of people, capable people with experience doing that. So we could do the fabrication of these foundations here in the state of Maine, as opposed to, having steel foundations developed elsewhere, which we don't really have the capability or competitive advantage in. So we're taking our existing construction engineering, we're taking our maritime expertise, we're putting all of these pieces together, and it's been initiated here a long time ago. We definitely were ahead of the curve in thinking about this, and still are very much at the forefront of this new technology and the deployment of it around the world. So I'll turn it over to Celina on the research array.
Sure, and the university could speak to their expand globally in advancing their technology, which I think is an important part of this. But I'll note for the proposed research array, we really want to make sure that we're using homegrown technology and having jobs locally here in Maine. And the demonstration project is a great way to do that. So that's why we're supporting that.
Just a couple of questions about that steel concrete balance. Concrete, isn't using concrete carbon intensive, or is there CO2 that can be stored in concrete? Help us figure out what we're hearing.
Yeah, I think that there's room to improve the carbon intensity of all industries, but concrete as well. Steel is also a pretty, it's a pretty carbon intensive industry as well. There are a lot of advances in green concrete now that we can build upon, and there are active projects that are being undertaken at the National Offshore Wind Research and Development Consortium to further that for the industry. So it's definitely part of the calculus and the thinking.
I really appreciate your ability to sort of pull all of the, there are so many headlines, so many little bits of information, and helping us make sense of it. It's much appreciated. Thank you. So well established, there are some brilliant people at the University of Maine who have designed this technology, and I assume that the incredible graduate students and staff, like they're not the only ones building these turbines. How does that work? Who builds the turbines? How does that get decided? Is the university also the contractor? Keep going on this trend of helping us understand complicated things.
I'm trying to figure out which piece to carve out there. And Celina, maybe you want to start with this one.
This is a major undertaking in terms of building a energy infrastructure. And so that there will be certain pieces that will have different entities will have an expertise. There will be somebody who manufactures the turbine. There's a number of turbine manufacturers who have the engineering and the skills necessary to make sure that those are operating safely and efficiently. Then you'll also have the experts on the foundation. You'll have mooring line experts. And so who and where all those people are, I think we'll figure that over time, but I imagine that it'll be a full team effort to build this. And some of these jobs are things that are already, as Stephanie mentioned, already happening in other industries. And so it's just applying them to offshore wind. Others are very unique to offshore wind, like how do you fix a floating turbine when it's out to sea? And so we'll require different skill sets, training to make sure that we can have the workforce and the supply chain to build these projects.
Yeah, I could just share a little bit from our offshore wind talent analysis that was part of the roadmap, and those consultants found that there were like 117 different occupations necessary for offshore wind. And those occupations range a variety of education levels. So we need everyone from people who are in the technical trades and skills trades, people who are at the university. We just need a really wide range of people with varying levels of, with different expertise, and we need everyone. I mean, one of the findings of the recent U.S. offshore wind supply chain and talent analysis was that we are short on everything. We're short on ports, we're short on vessels, we're short on people. We are short on companies that are already in this industry. So we need everything. We need all hands on deck. I think actually Will said that at our last advisory committee meeting. So there are opportunities for everyone in this space.
And that feels particularly powerful and important for a state like Maine, right? We need more people and more young people, particularly, right? So is that part of this analysis of Maine's commitment to pursuing offshore wind, is bringing some of those people and jobs here in state?
Yes, I think we had a number of discussions in our working groups about, you know, we already have a workforce shortage in Maine. We have this new industry that's developing here too. And how can we bring more talent into the state as well as our existing talent and raise all of that up, and maybe raise up the skills that are particularly broad, right? Like electricians and welders are needed across a variety of industries, but we can support that training so that it's supports the offshore wind industry, but it also supports other clean energy industries. It can support other broader industries in the state. So I think it's really important for us to continue pursuing that, and recognizing that offshore wind in the state could be a real attractor of people to the state, and attractor of whole families, and bringing up a lot of the needs for additional workforce, but also, you know, diversify our state as well, which will be really great.
And you said you mentioned a little bit about MCV's friends at the Iron Workers 7 getting a grant to work on offshore wind. Can you say a little bit more about the role that Maine's labor unions play in this build out of offshore wind?
Yeah, so that's right. Through the Clean Energy Partnership that was launched using Maine Jobs and Recovery funding, the state was really looking at renewable energy broadly in terms of how can we develop the workforce for the future. And so partnering with existing education institutions, labor unions, and others to put funding into programs for Mainers. And so that is what we issued a grant for. It's on the tip of my tongue, but I can tell you a little bit more about it if I remember in a minute. But what the proposal was from the Iron Workers under development, and then I also say that we in Maine are want to make sure that we are supporting good paying family support jobs when we are advancing offshore wind, and we appreciate the iron workers and the role that they played in the advisory committee and working group level in helping us develop a set of objectives and strategies that really get at how to support Maine working family jobs that are going to, you know, long careers for Maine people. And so we will continue to work with our friends, and also recognize that we want to make sure that we are utilizing people, resources and people in Maine too. So that's an important balance that we have to think about how we build this workforce.
It is really exciting on just so many fronts. Of course, all human action has an impact on the environment. How do you think about weighing the potential environmental impacts against the climate benefits when it comes to offshore wind? And I'm thinking particularly about some of the wildlife interactions that we've heard about, seen headlines about. How do we make that calculation in our minds?
I think one of the most important pieces is to make sure that we have the information to inform responsible offshore wind. So some of the ways we are doing that, guided by the recommendations from the working group in the roadmap. But we are, we're establishing the Maine Offshore Wind Research Consortium, which will look at avoiding and reducing impacts on both the environment and existing ocean users. We will be using that forum too, I think I mentioned, to try to leverage the resources from other regional entities, maybe the federal government as well, just to make sure that we have the information that we need to pursue this industry responsibly in the Gulf of Maine and beyond. So I think research has a really key role here.
And what does the research say about floating offshore wind and whales as opposed to fixed bottom offshore wind?
We're in early stages of learning about floating offshore wind because it hasn't really been deployed commercially anywhere, right? So we're all kind of learning together. But the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management has been commissioning some different studies on interactions with marine mammals and other species as well, including birds. And so they have a number of those available through their environmental studies program, and they try to incorporate some of the learnings of those studies into the guidance that they provide for commercial offshore wind projects and to how they review some of those plans that come in from developers. So, that's just one pathway of learning more and trying to make sure that it's implemented to help responsible offshore wind.
That's true. Oh, go ahead, Celina.
I would also add that in addition to the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, the NOAA will have a responsibility to do relevant permitting for any future projects. And so they'll utilize the best available technology, or not technology, best information when making those decisions. We also, the BOEM and NOAA have recently announced, I think shared a draft strategy about how to responsibly advance offshore wind while protecting marine mammals and other species. And so there's more work to be done. There's more research that's needed. We also will continue to learn together as we do this and want to make sure that we're not building projects that are hurting marine life.
Thank you. It's so reassuring to know that the process has multiple points where we're stopping to say we don't want to do more harm here. Is there also research around how offshore wind infrastructure can actually improve or support fishing, navigation, carbon storage? I hope that the analysis is looking at all those big opportunities as well as the potential risks.
Yes, absolutely. There are a number of research entities around the world that are looking at, how to provide benefits for multiple purposes. I know they've found in some of the fixed foundation projects, Celina talked about, there's the fixed to the seafloor projects and the floating ones. So some of the earlier projects, or all the earlier projects really were fixed, and they looked at the ability to attract marine life and provide additional habitat for marine life to colonize. Block Island has done some research about their fish populations and how they've fared around that initial offshore wind farm in the US. In terms of floating, that's all relatively new, but we also have the National Offshore Wind Research and Development Consortium that looks at all of these things, like the life cycle, greenhouse gas of impacts of projects. They look at multiple benefits of turbines to and coexistence with fishing. I mean, there are a lot of different aspects that many different people and partnerships are looking at.
We're getting close to the end of our time now, so I want to remind everybody that there is so much more to learn and explore. I'm going to ask one more question, and then we'll go into reminding folks to sign up for the the newsletter and all of those good things. But you mentioned a couple of different processes that are underway. And it sounds like the roadmap, which is going to be finalized later this month, is distinct from the Ports Advisory Group, which I think has a little bit of a different timeline. Can you say more about how Maine is approaching both the offshore and the onshore aspects of launching this new industry?
Yeah, and what part of the reason why we wanted to start with some of those visuals about how big these projects are is that we will need a place to build them if we want to have the jobs here in Maine. And so that's why we collectively are looking at where does it make sense to manufacture and fabricate and deploy these floating turbines. And so to help answer that question, the Department of Transportation launched this advisory group to look at, we have a number of deep water ports in Maine. How can we identify where it makes the most sense to pursue an offshore wind port that will help bring those local jobs here to the state and also help. So we're going through that process now. They've gone through a number of different scenarios of what that could look like in terms of location and layout, all that. More than anyone is probably interested in, can look at the layout plans that have been proposed as options for discussion. I think the Department of Transportation is taking a look at what are the environmental impacts associated with this and what are the other impacts and what makes the most sense from a planning perspective. They're going to have some steps that they go through this year. And when those meetings are scheduled, we'll be sure to make sure that that's published and shared widely so that people who are interested can engage. And lastly, I know that the Department of Transportation and the Maine Port Authority are always happy to talk if people have questions or want to learn more about the proposals or the process.
That is really helpful. And I just have to give a shout out to my colleague, Beth Ahern, who is co-chairing the Ports Advisory Group. And we're just so grateful to be for Beth's leadership and for all of the participation in that process. You, Stephanie and Celina, have really helped us understand today, I think, how many moving parts there are, and that, you know, on the one hand, there's this temptation to think, well, let's figure out all the details before we take any steps at all. And then there's the time that it takes to do that, and the length of the process, and the need to kind of hold multiple things in our minds as we're moving forward. And I'm so grateful to know that the process is in good hands. Thanks to both of you, Celina Cunningham and Stephanie Watson, for being with us today. Thanks to the whole team at the Governor's Energy Office. You all accomplish really phenomenal things, and we appreciate your leadership. And thanks to everyone who participates in the Offshore Wind Roadmap process and that Ports Advisory Group and all of the other pieces of the puzzle. I recognize lots of names and faces on this call today, and we couldn't do this work without you. As I mentioned earlier, we are going to stay with offshore wind and this theme next week and take a closer look at legislation to jumpstart the offshore wind industry. So you heard a couple of things today that may have tipped you off that we've got some really interesting coalitions of folks coming together around offshore wind, Maine environmental groups, labor unions. We're working together on two bills in particular that will boost the development of responsibly developed floating offshore wind in the Gulf of Maine. And those bills both hold equity and environmental protection at their cores. They include provisions that require the mitigation of environmental impacts, ensure strong labor protections, and foster really inclusive benefits for Maine's most vulnerable communities. So we'll do a deep dive on those bills next week. There'll be a link to register for those programs in this afternoon's follow-up email. We'll have a whole panel of advocates who are leading the charge, including MCV's Energy Justice Manager, Kelt Wilska, I hope to see all of you here again next week. And until then, thank you so much for being with us today and with us in this work. Have a absolutely terrific weekend. Thanks again, Celina and Stephanie.